Welcome back, everyone, to the CUHK Faculty of Law Conference on Teaching and Learning in Law Directions in Legal Education 2022. We'll continue with Parallel Session 2, Group 1. I'm the Chair, Queenie Lai from CUHK Law. As with previous sessions, we invite participants to send questions to me via the private chat function of Zoom, and I will read out the relevant questions during the Q&A session of each panel session. So our first speakers is Professor Anne Hewitt and Dr. Stacey Henderson from University of Adelaide. I understand that only Professor Anne Hewitt can join us today. Hello, Anne, hi. But Dr. Stacey Henderson won't be able to join us today. Just a brief background. Professor Anne Hewitt is an Associate Professor of Law at the University of Adelaide and a Principal Fellow of the Higher Education Academy. Focusing on the intersections of law and education, her publications cover topics such as legal education, pedagogy, the regulation of education, and the rights of students undertaking work in their formal education. And Dr. Stacey Henderson is a lecturer of law at the University of Adelaide. Professor Hewitt and Dr. Henderson will be presenting on the topic, Managing the Risk of Discrimination and Harassment for Legal Interns. I understand that we have a pre-recorded presentation video from Professor Hewitt, but Professor Hewitt would like to say a few words before the video. Professor Hewitt.
Thank you so much. Everybody, I'm very sorry, but Stacy has COVID and is feeling terrible. So to allow you to hear from both of us, I thought we should play our recorded presentation, though I'm here to answer any questions. But I did want to say before that was played that, first of all, I apologize for not presenting live, but I thought it would be beneficial for everyone to see Stacey as well. And to express our delight to be involved in the conference, but also to acknowledge that Stacey and I are on the lands of the Kaurna and the Peramangk people here in Adelaide. We would like at the commencement of our presentation to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands where we have done the work, which we will be speaking about, and to acknowledge their continued connection to these lands. So thank you very much, Queenie. If you'd like to play the presentation, and then as questions come in, I'm very happy to answer them all. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. I do hope Stacey do better soon. Here is the presentation.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today at the Directions in Legal Education Conference. I'm Dr. Stacey Henderson from Adelaide Law School at the University of Adelaide, and I'm here with my co-presenter, Associate Professor Anne Hewitt, also from Adelaide Law School. We're going to be speaking to you today about managing the risks of discrimination and harassment for legal interns.
So, we're delighted to have the opportunity to talk to you about this important problem and some of the things that we've been. The reason that we believe that this is such a relevant issue is that increasingly employers expect that all graduates, including legal graduates, will already have practical workplace experience to make them competitive for graduate positions. There's quite a lot of evidence of that. So in 2016, the United Kingdom's Social Mobility Commission reported that work experience and internships were the new must-have for graduates entering into the labour market. And a 2020 United Kingdom survey indicated that 1/3 of companies admitted that they are not very likely or not likely at all to recruit graduates who don't have work experience on their CV. And in that context, undertaking work experience, clinical placements or internships is considered so vital to gain experience that they've been described as the new degree. That expectation that graduates need work experience to be competitive for graduate employment also seems to hold true here in Australia, where Stacey and I are working. And in the Australian context, a major legal recruitment company advises law graduates to ensure that they have practical experience as much as they can get, actually more than they were thinking, double it, then do a bit more. Do it, paid or unpaid, and it will pay off. Not doing it will pay off as well. Try to get clerkships and do as many as you can. So we have a strong pressure for our law students to engage in practical workplace learning.
At the same time, we're recognising that bullying, discrimination and sexual harassment are endemic in our society, including in the legal profession. In 2019, a report from the International Bar Association reported that Australian legal workplaces are rife with bullying and sexual harassment.
So here are some examples of high-profile instances of bullying and harassment in the Australian legal profession. And I'm sure that these experiences are shared internationally. Certainly the International Bar Association report suggested Australia was not alone in this context. What Stacey and I are doing that we feel is unique is focusing on the role of legal practitioners operating as supervisors for students doing internships, clerkships and work experience as integral to that participant's experience. They're acting as supervisors, as mentors, and as experienced colleagues who are facilitating the young person's transition into a prestigious profession. And in that role, they develop a close relationship with the participant and are critical to supporting them in their placement, but also in developing their understanding of cultural norms within the legal profession. And given the ongoing critique of the legal profession as continuing to harbour discriminatory behaviour and bullying and sexual harassment, we believe that the profession has a social, moral and legal obligation to ensure that everyone in the workplaces, legal workplaces, are protected from those inappropriate behaviours and are equipped and supported to respond to them. That can't be achieved without engaged, informed and committed members of the profession acting as supervisors for these vulnerable members of legal workplaces, those who are engaged in clerkships, internships and work experience.
Students who are undertaking work integrated learning are particularly vulnerable to bullying, harassment and abuse. They're often inexperienced. They're desperate to gain some work experience and employability skills, industry contacts, and they need to sometimes complete a placement to obtain course credit and complete their degrees. As a consequence, they're in a particularly vulnerable position where they might be asked to undertake tasks which are unethical. They might be treated inappropriately. They might be bullied, asked to work long hours, or to undertake work without adequate supervision. There's anecdotal and statistical evidence that this vulnerability is being exploited. For example, the recently released Australian National Report on the prevalence of sexual harassment and sexual assault among university students found that 5.9% of instances of sexual harassment identified in the 2021 study occurred when the student was on a university work placement. This suggests that the cultural problems that infest our workplaces affect the most junior participants, perhaps even more than others.
This is a particular problem for students engaged in workplace learning because they are often not protected by many of the measures that could operate to ameliorate some of those risks for other workplace participants. In many instances, universities have no power to dictate or control the behaviour of host organisations, those organisations where students are actually doing their work, and may choose not to implement protections that could be instituted, for instance, through contractual arrangements with hosts. Perhaps because they are prioritising maintaining the relationship with the host so as to ensure future students could be placed, or because of the workload constraints that creating and managing such contracts could involve. In addition, students here in Australia often don't receive the protections of prohibitions of discrimination and sexual harassment that are enacted in legislation for other members of a workplace, so particularly for employees, because students engaged in workplace learning are often exempt from the definition of employees under that legislation. They don't receive protection. Similarly, they're often not covered by host organisation policies. So the host of a legal intern or work experience student may have a policy prohibiting employees from engaging in discrimination or sexual harassment in the workplace, but that policy may not extend to cover others in the workplace, such as student learners.
The situation isn't good enough. As law schools, we have a social, moral, and legal obligation to support and protect our students' learning in the workplace.
While there are resources out there that are intended to fill this gap, we found that they weren't suitable for use by law students engaged in workplace learning. Often the resources that were available were generalised. They were about the risks of physical injury if you're working in farms or in laboratories or in health settings. They were about the importance of maintaining patient confidentiality for the allied health professions. And they often failed to address the risks of office work. We theorised this may be because they were perceived by the university to be less immediate than the risks of physical injury, violation of privacy, or intellectual property disputes that may arise in other contexts. So what we perceived we needed to do was to develop resources that would be of more use to our law students. And what we tried to do is create resources that were relevant for our students in their context. So to educate students about the risks to them in legal workplaces and what they can reasonably do to avail themselves of the protections that may be available, but also to seek assistance and support in various ways. And to offer them advice and counselling from senior members of the profession about how to respond to negative workplace behaviours that they observe or are subject to.
So we've designed some additional resources, and this is the project that we're speaking to you about today. The project seeks to deliver training and resources that are specifically crafted for legal workplaces and that can inform participants of any work integrated learning or work experience of their rights, assist them in recognising and responding to inappropriate workplace behaviours, that can provide supervision materials and training for those supervising work experience participants, and to help the workplaces and those in them to engage in positive cultural change.
As the resources we created, we've created a series of legal case studies about the kinds of inappropriate behaviours that students may encounter in the workplace. And then we have created a series of videos where members of the profession, senior and junior solicitors and barristers, speak to those case studies and offer advice to junior participants in the workplace about how they could respond. The sorts of things that they could do both practically within the context to protect themselves and respond to the behaviours, but also more broadly to try and seek change within the workplace and to protect themselves and future employees against that kind of behaviour in the future. Because we were speaking to a legally informed audience, we also created quite detailed and legally informed resources about legal rights, legal avenues of complaint, and legal resources that could be used by students who encountered problematic behaviours. We created one version of the resources for students and one for host firms to ensure that both were on the same page, but were engaging with the resources from the appropriate perspective, relevant to their role in protecting students in the workplace and creating cultural change. We're going to talk to you today about particularly these video resources, and we're going to give you some short excerpts of what they involve. So the first video excerpt that we're going to show you is responding to a scenario involving bullying in the workplace. The student involved was Natara, who is engaging in placement in a firm where it becomes clear over time that the expectations that she will work extremely long hours. That ends up with her responding to emails at 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. in the morning, and one night actually sleeping in the office, and then in fact being yelled at by her supervisor for appearing in rumpled clothes, and told that the expectation is that she will appear bright, fresh and presentable in the morning rather than in the clothes she wore the day before. So here is Tina Tran, a solicitor in Adelaide and the president of the Asian Lawyers Society, talking about that bullying scenario.
Well, my initial thought was with this scenario was that the obvious barrier is this is her first placement and she's not sure what to do. They're placing a lot of pressure on her and she's obviously very frazzled in her position. My first instinct would be to go seek out another supervisor in the firm. Is there anyone else who is superior to her position that she can talk to? Are there any, like you said, allies in the firm that she can speak to about the working conditions that she's being placed under? Because obviously this is very unusual. You shouldn't be working all hours of the clock on demand from your supervisor, and you shouldn't be expected to answer emails at 2 a.m. in the morning. That's not what the reality should be. And even though sometimes you hear that there's no work-life balance, we fall into the trap, I think, as younger law graduates that, oh, this is how it's meant to be. But really, it's not the norm, and it shouldn't be the norm because this will result in a burnout one day.
So in the second scenario that we're going to show you, we have Barrister Holly Veal responding to a scenario involving a placement student who has accompanied a senior practitioner on a regional work trip. In the circumstances that she is then propositioned by that solicitor while on that trip. She flees and does not return to complete her placement.
Times have changed and the tide is turning. There are very few people in this legal profession that we're in today who would agree that that behaviour is in any way, shape or form appropriate. As difficult as it is for Christina, and as much as she should not be in this position, my strong advice to her would be to report the behaviour of the senior solicitor. She can do that.
So we've done a number of things to distribute these resources. We've integrated them into the final year curriculum here in the Adelaide Law School. We've also distributed them to the profession. And we're going to hold a series of workshops in which we engage with future supervisors to discuss with them how they can best support law students and use these resources as a platform for engaging discussion and educating the practitioners about student rights and how they can be supported.
We welcome any questions that you might have for us about the project and the resources we've developed.
Thank you so much, Professor Hewitt and Dr. Henderson, for this very, very unique project and for raising awareness of this important issue of workplace bullying and harassment for student interns. I think what you're doing is very unique because for many law schools, we have support for careers and internship search, but we rarely think about raising awareness about their workplace rights. And I totally agree with you that our students are in a vulnerable position and that we have a social, moral, and legal obligation to protect them. So what I found really interesting with your project is, creating a wealth of resources, the video samples and feedback from practitioners for our students to learn more about this. So my first question is, you've actually mentioned the university have limited power to protect our students and actually little interest. So what motivates you and Stacy in the first place to take on this project?
Both Stacey and I have a practice background. We probably well remember painful junior days. I think that finding your feet in a profession is extremely challenging. There is a lot to learn and a lot of cultural, I guess, adaptation required. But both Stacey and I are really interested in creating awareness raising amongst our students. I think this flows so brilliantly from what Nat was talking about earlier. These ideas about recognizing the problems in our profession, to not turn a blind eye to our history, which is problematic and embedded with issues of discrimination, harassment, bullying. To not ignore that, but instead we're trying to empower our students to be part of positive change. So we've made a deliberate effort throughout the course that we co-coordinate to integrate ethics and the ethics of professional practice in a very broad sense at every level, not just in how our students as future lawyers will deal with other practitioners or the duties that they may have to the court, but the broader obligations of a professional and the many dimensions of that. So given that that is one of our focuses in our teaching, and we're so interested in trying to engage in cultural reform in the profession, I think this was a natural next step to try and perhaps bridge the two and say, well, how can we facilitate our students entering into the profession as empowered individuals, but at the same time, try and bring the profession on board with us and try and ensure that that discussion which is happening happens as loudly as possible, so that hopefully we don't find in another 5 years, if we conduct a survey like Natalie did, that people say nothing has changed. We want to hear that there has been change.
Thank you, Anne. No, I really applaud your efforts in making this step positive change for our students. And I'm sure all the participants in our session agree you're creating an impact, not just within your faculty, you're bringing awareness to all of us through this international conference. My second question is, you have given an excellent example of workplace bullying in your video, where a supervisor requesting an intern to work till 2 a.m. I'm just very curious, in reality, students or interns who face workplace bullying or, more often microaggressions, they find it hard to speak up because they were afraid to be labeled as troublemaker or complainer or whistleblower or gossiper or the weak link. And in reality, how would you advise these students to deal with workplace bullying or microaggression? Because actually it's very hard to prove these.
Absolutely. And that's one of the reasons that we chose the strategy we did of asking members of the profession to provide this advice. So, excuse me, I'm just going to take a sip of water. Within the videos, we have a range of different practitioners who acknowledge the challenges that students will face. Excuse me, it's cold and flu season here in Adelaide.
No problem, take your time.
So the practitioners are able to acknowledge those challenges. But I think with a great deal of authenticity that perhaps Stacey and I don't have as now academics rather than practitioners, to state that students raising those issues will be heard, that the profession has changed and wants to change further, and that there is a variety of workplaces out there, and that they can, if one workplace culture doesn't suit them, that they should value themselves and think about seeking other alternatives. So we're hoping that by engaging the voices of the profession, that we're giving an authenticity which recognises the challenges, but also presents genuine voices working now, saying, I would believe this, I would recommend this, I would listen to a student who knocked on my door and raised this issue, and this is what I would tell them to do.
Thank you so much, Anne. No, I think it's a very real issue, which should be more discussed and talked about. It's not just, you know, the outright discrimination. It's usually, you know, workplace bullying and subtle microaggressions that can really create, you know, mental stress and emotional stress for victims on a day-to-day basis. So by raising awareness, you know, that students at least know it's an issue that they can deal with. My last question, my very last question is, what are the responses? Because I think you've mentioned you've shared those videos with host firms and professions. So what are the responses from the professions and students who have seen your video? Did you do any survey? Or
we haven't as yet. We've shared the resources with some of the firms where students from our university are being placed in internships and clerkships as a part of their university study. And we've organised that later in the year, we're going to run some broader professional development workshops, which we have obtained funding so that we can run them for free, so that members of the profession can attend and get some compulsory professional development credits by attending a workshop with a supervisory focus. And we will do some evaluations of those workshops at that stage. What we found so far through the anecdotal feedback from firms is that firms are very happy to agree that these are real issues and are delighted that students have been informed about their rights, but have been quite reluctant to engage in material change. For instance, reviewing their internal policies to check the extent to which students are protected by those policies, or agreeing to insert clauses into their contracts with the university about the host placement. So I think if I was to summarise, I would say that they are talking the talk, but not walking the walk.
Thank you for sharing. And I do hope that more can be done for, you know, any workplace environment to create a more healthy work environment and more inclusive environment. So thank you so much, Professor Hewitt, today for sharing this very important topic. I think time requires me to move on to our second speaker. And it's Mrs. Charlotte Harrison. She'll be sharing with us the Valueme Framework, Increasing Self-Awareness and Career Confidence in Law Graduates. Charlotte is a principal lecturer in law and the Director of Employability at Portsmouth Law School, following a first career as a solicitor. Charlotte has a significant and sustained record of research-informed curriculum development and innovation to support graduate employability. She brings a wealth of experience in supporting students develop career management skills and career confidence through one-to-one support and embedded programs. And recent publications include an evaluation of an embedded activity to increase employability-related self-confidence. Charlotte is also the author From Student to Solicitor, a career guide for aspiring solicitors. Mrs. Harrison, thank you.
Thank you, Queenie, for that introduction. I'm hoping that you can all see my slides now, which I've shared with you. And thank you, Anne and Stacey, for that really interesting insight into such an important project. I'll be looking forward to seeing what comes of that. So it would be lovely to keep in touch and to hear that, and get well soon to Stacey as well. Welcome everybody, and thank you for sharing the session with me today. I'm really happy to be speaking to you about the Valueme Framework, which is a framework that I developed for my second year undergraduate students on our law degree at Portsmouth University, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that today. It's a framework that I developed for the second years, but which has since been used with our postgraduate students, and which is now part of the of my institution's personal tutoring and development framework. It's been embedded as an activity within that overarching framework. And I've also developed some spin-off projects as well for this. One was used with new business owners and another one with much younger learners in a school and a secondary school or high school setting. So in terms of the shape of the agenda then for this session, And I'm planning to use the sort of 20 minutes and then to leave some time for questions at the end. I want to talk to you a little bit about the aims of the framework. So to talk to you about the local context and why I decided to develop this framework. Then to talk to you a little bit about the theoretical underpinnings as well, so how it works in practice and the theoretical underpinnings behind it. And then I'm going to give you a snapshot of the evaluation that I did with some colleagues that was written up. I'm going to focus more on the sort of practical implications and how it's been implemented. So it will just be a snapshot of the evaluation. But if you want to find out a little bit more about the study, or if you are struggling to sleep this evening, then you can find the copy of the paper here in Studies in Higher Education. So do have a look. And just a little flag that it was previously called Brand Me and is now called Valueme, but it's the same intervention. Okay, so why did I put this together for our second years? Well, as I say, it was developed originally for second years, and it was part of a year-long career management module for those students. And so Valueme was an integral activity within that module. And it really came from a place that I wanted students to recognise the value of the skills and experience that they were already bringing to the workplace, but perhaps they'd failed to kind of recognise the value of that to employers. I wanted also to give students access to the language to present themselves confidently to employers, but also authentically. And that resonates with what Professor Skeed was talking about in her keynote, that point about allowing students to move away from what they're not, what they're pretending to be, perhaps what they think a lawyer looks like, and actually to present themselves in a way that feels really authentic to them, and crucially to be very proud of their offer, of their value proposition to employers. It helps. My intention was to help them with the inevitable tell me about yourself question that we know they will face in the first 5 minutes of an interview, but which is tricky and which often means that they are kind of scrabbling around, thinking about what to say, thinking about the key elements that they want to share of themselves with the employer. So to help with that, but more broadly to help with interviews generally, to help with the networking events, the careers fairs, the employer engagement through work experience, so the first day or first few days in a new internship, to actually have the confidence to speak about themselves in positive terms. Because this was developed pre-pandemic, if any of us can think that far back, part of it was also to get them comfortable with the technology for the video interviews that were then new, but which have become ubiquitous in the recruitment process, and to get used to that quite artificial way of engaging with employers as well. So that's the background to it, really. And this is what Valueme is. So essentially, it's no more than a 2 to 3 minute elevator pitch. So your Valueme presentation is a 2 to 3 minute pitch to an employer, or if we have students who are very entrepreneurially minded, maybe they're pitching to an investor or to a collaborator, but more likely they are pitching themselves to the recruitment panel in the law firm that they are applying to. And so in delivering that pitch, the students have to first identify, of course, their aspirations, their motivations, their values, their qualities and skills, and then to decide how they're going to package those and to communicate them to the employer. And those abilities have been linked, we know, in the literature to improved employability. And they're also developing their ability to articulate those skills concisely, confidently, and articulately. So they do these presentations at 3 points during the academic year. They do them in a classroom setting. The presentations are recorded and they are stored in an online portal. So the students can go back to those presentations after they've done them, and they can also track their progress over the 3 presentations that they've done. So they get their own self-reflection immediately after that presentation. They can go back to the video for more deeper reflection. They will also get feedback from their tutor and from the peers in the room. And the feedback from peers becomes richer and more sophisticated as the process goes on, as those students become clearer for themselves about the hallmarks of what a good Valueme presentation looks like. And then they also get an additional layer of feedback from what we called mock employers. And those are people with recruitment experience who watch the individual presentations in the portal and who give a rating and also some narrative feedback to the students about how they came across to that employer and how they might develop the presentation going forward. It's probably just worth saying that it was never expected that the students would deliver these presentations verbatim to an employer. That might be a little bit strange and artificial, but the presentations really act as the vehicle to harness that reflection that they're doing through the module and to give them something tangible to work on through the year. So if we just break that down a little bit further, I said that this was part of a long, thin or a year-long module. So within the module, between the presentations, the students would be having workshops around what we might call the foundation elements of the Valueme presentation, those pillars that are showing on the slide now. So they would be looking at their skills, the skills that an employer looks for, and then thinking about the extent to which they can demonstrate those skills and where perhaps their development areas might lie. They will be thinking about their core strengths, the qualities that they're bringing to the law firm. They'll be thinking about their own core values, their work values, and the corporate values of the firms that they're going to be targeting. They'll be thinking about what Simon Sinek describes as their why, so their purpose, what motivates them, what drives them, and then thinking about their personality as well. And crucially, I suppose, underpinning all of this is to get them thinking about what success looks like to them and what kind of environment will enable the best version of themselves to thrive. So really trying to personalise the learning that's coming from this. Of course, they will need evidence, they will need examples to support the claims that they're making. And as they move towards the end of the presentations, kind of towards the third one, they'll be thinking in more detail about the language and the style and the form of the presentation that they want to adopt in order to really make it authentic to them. And so the question that they're answering essentially in that presentation is: an employer should value me because this is what I'm offering. We've had to scaffold it a little bit more recently because we've been delivering it not only with younger learners in schools, but also for our first year students. So we've introduced a poster to scaffold the learning and then the 3 presentations. And I've talked about the feedback here, so I'm not going to linger on that part of the slide anymore. And in terms of the theoretical underpinnings, I really like the Career Edge model. It's one that I've worked with a lot. And thank you to Dr. Lorraine Daprapul for allowing me to use the updated diagram here for these slides, because they've updated the Career Edge model to Career Edge Plus this year. The Career Edge model, if you're not familiar with it, talks about those items that you can see at the bottom line there, those foundation elements, of course, as being absolutely crucial to developing employability, but that they are really the foundation level, and that it's those opportunities to give students to reflect, to evaluate their experiences and all those things on the bottom line that increases what they originally called the 3 S's, so self-esteem, self-efficacy and self-confidence, which mediates the increases in employability. So what Valueme is doing, or is intending to do, is to give a framework to students to engage in that blue circle at the bottom, the career development learning, which I think is often something that is missed or is quite difficult to engage with students. So it's giving them a framework for that learning. But crucially, it's also offering them facilitated and structured opportunities for that reflection and evaluation on all of those foundational elements through those repeated presentations and the work that we do in between. And so the students develop those Valueme presentations through the cycle of experiential learning. Each presentation, of course, becomes its own concrete experience. And at the end of that, the students can reflect on their experience, reflect on what they saw of others who were presenting in the room, reflect on their understanding of what employers are looking for, and then plan, reconceptualize and set goals for the next presentation. And those goals might be around the content, they might be around the delivery or the structure, they might be around gaps that they've identified in their CV, something they'd really like to talk about, but that they found difficult, so they're going to go away and work on that for the next iteration. The other model that I think is worth discussing is the Tomlinson Graduate Capital model, Michael Tomlinson, and he has encapsulated the resources that students will need for a successful transition into the world of work into those 5 capitals that are on the slide. And I think we spend a lot of time, rightly so, working around the social and cultural capital by giving students lots of opportunities for employer engagement, for work experience, alumni engagement, mentoring, etc. But I think sometimes we don't always give as much focus to the identity capital. And so that's one of the things that Valueme seeks to do. And I would suggest that as students focus more on the identity capital, or as we encourage them to do so, they actually will be better placed to engage with those social and social and cultural capital opportunities. They should feel more confident about their offer. They might feel more confident about reaching out to those employer engagement opportunities, for turning up to law fairs, etc., armed with that sense of, this is who I am, this is what I've got to offer, I feel proud of this and I'm going to go forward accordingly. I've talked about the experiential learning. I will just briefly mention the Johari window model, which of course is a really useful model for helping students to understand and develop their self-awareness and to think about how they are perceived by others and how they want to be perceived by others. So it can be quite useful to deliver that explicitly to students as part of this activity. I said it was evaluated, and so just a couple of snapshots then about the evaluation. We did this as a longitudinal mixed method study. So we ran it for the full academic year that the students were doing the Valueme presentations, plus 6 or 8 months after that, as they progressed into final year, we caught up with them again then. We took quantitative measurements, and to do that we measured employability related self-confidence at the 3 points in time that they were doing the Valueme presentations, and we managed to get that from a sample of 105 students. So there were 167 on the module and we got the data from 105 of them. And to get that, we used third-party evaluations of those Valueme presentations. So we used the mock employers who were employed as research assistants for the project. We used them working in pairs with very carefully calibrated and conferenced results, not only to give the rating and the feedback to the students, which was valuable and authentic for them, but also to capture the data for the employability-related self-confidence. We gave them a 5-point Likert scale based on findings from the literature relating to factors linked to ERSC and also effective face-to-face communication. And then for the qual side of things, we borrowed from the human resource development field, and we used a framework called Kirkpatrick. Some of you might be familiar with it. It's used commonly in organisations to evaluate coaching and learning development programs. So it examines learning gain or measures learning gain from those activities. And it has 3 levels, the first being reactions. So what was the students' or learners' reaction to this intervention? The second being, is there evidence of learning? And then finally, third, is there evidence of behaviour change? So transferring that learning into other contexts. And there's a 4th level that we didn't look at for the purposes of this study. And what we found was, through the quants data, we found that there were statistically significant increases in the confidence ratings at the 3 points in time as they went through. And although, of course, we can't prove cause and effect, we did find that that was also borne out through the qualitative data as well. So I've got something on that in the next slide. So, as I say, we saw increases in ERSC, but we also saw that the qualitative feedback from both lecturers and students supported those findings and recognised that students had learnt the skills of confident self-promotion, but that really pleasingly they were transferring that learning into the real world environment. So they were talking about, they'd used this in interviews, they'd used this in assessment centres, they'd used it in presentations in the workplace on their placements, for example. I think one of the things that we were particularly pleased with was that we had a 75% participation rate, so at all 3 presentations on this activity, even though it was embedded, but it wasn't compulsory and it wasn't assessed in the first iteration. So I think a 75% participation rate in a non-assessed career management learning activity is a positive outcome. And I might suggest that it's partly because they saw the relevance of this. That came through a lot of the feedback from the students. They saw why this mattered. They saw that this was important. They saw the relevance in terms of their own employability, but also they began to get this really strong intrinsic motivation to do better at each performance, to encourage each other to do better at each performance as they went through the programme, and I think as they began to saw the value. So I am not suggesting that Valueme is the answer to all of our career management or employability challenges. Of course I'm not, but I do believe, and I've used it for a long time now, I do believe it's a useful framework to support some of that learning, and crucially to support students' self-awareness, but also their skills in self-promotion and their skills in self-confidence, which is now even more important, I think, post-pandemic, when a lot of them have lost that opportunity to network and have lost that opportunity to communicate in that way. But I would say it does need to be implemented in accordance with the provisos that I've put on the slide there, and which are covered in a lot more detail in the study, if you're interested in reading it. And so in terms of where it has been or where it might be implemented, as I said, we have used it in a core embedded module, but we have also now adopted it across the university in the personal tutoring and development framework. But I've also seen it used as a standalone extracurricular activity, as a sort of short programme, and also as a blended and digital offer. So we delivered it in that way for the business owners that we were working with. And lastly, I've just got a couple of testimonials really. So these are quotes taken from the study and also that have been sent with me and that I've used with permission from students that have used and engaged with this process outside of the study. And I think my favourite is the incredible value of it was the way it forced me to reflect and the chain reaction it kicked off. That's what Valueme did for me, made me think about what I was trying to say in a nutshell, and it's a powerful and profound process if you take it seriously. And then there's another couple here, and then I've got a reference slide for anyone who's interested in reading more about the sources, and I'm really happy to take questions as well.
Thank you so much, Charlotte, for sharing this really original and interesting project. So I personally am aware that business school have long developed, soft skill courses like personal branding and confidence building courses. But for law school, I think we do provide career or resume support, but less so in confidence building. So it's a very original project. Thanks, Charlotte. I've got a couple of questions. Can you tell me what is the difference, in your opinion, the difference between your Valueme project and traditional mock work interviews practice, and which do you think help students more?
Yeah, good question. I think they're both crucial, and I think they're different, so important but different. I think there's no substitute for the mock interviews, of course. I think students need to be in that pressured environment. They need to have an opportunity to have the questions and to think about how they're going to respond to them. So I think that's absolutely crucial. I think the difference with Valueme is that it's a much more holistic process, and it's focusing very much on that individual student and what they can bring. So I think whereas with an interview preparation, it's pretty wide ranging. They're probably going to get questions, yes, about themselves and what they can bring, but also technical questions. They're also going to be getting the commercial awareness questions that Professor Skeed was talking about earlier, and questions, of course, about why they're joining the firm and other questions around that. So I think what this does is it enables a deeper exploration of the students' motivations and of their strengths. I think the connection is not just in terms of now I can pitch to you in the tell me about yourself, or why should you hire me, why am I a good fit with this firm. I think it has huge benefits there because they are able to offer a much more personalised, more compelling answer, I think, to those questions, really showing they've reflected. But also what we found is because of all the underpinning work that students are doing, they're also well prepared for the competency questions on the application forms and in the interview. So, tell me where you've demonstrated excellent teamwork. Well, they've thought about that. They may not have used it in the final Valueme presentation, but they've probably, on their poster or somewhere, they've had to think about how they've demonstrated those skills and where. And I think certainly for the strengths-based questions as well, then this prepares them really nicely for that, because they're very clear of their own motivations and their own preferences. So important but different.
Yes, thanks, Charlotte. Thank you for sharing the difference between the Valueme and the mock work interviews. My second question is, you've mentioned about multi-source feedback from peers, tutors, and mock employers. First of all, I'm curious, how do you get mock employers involved to support this exercise? And also, are there any guidance in giving feedback? You've mentioned ratings and narrative feedback. Is it oral or written feedback, so that I can learn more about this?
Yeah, really good question again. So yeah, managing the mock employers was the more logistically challenging part of the project. For the study, of course, it was even more challenging because we had double the amount of mock employers, because we wanted them to work in pairs so we could conference the results. When I've run it subsequently, I've just had them working on their own, because I didn't need to be quite so rigorous for the research purposes. So essentially, we put out a recruitment call for people who were interested. Subsequently, when it became quite difficult to get employers, we used colleagues from the Careers and Employability Service. So they were willing to be trained, and they were interested in the framework, and so they acted as our mock employers. And I think the reality is, as long as they have got genuine insight into what employers are looking for and they can offer good quality feedback, it doesn't really matter who they are or where they're coming from. And if you've got a big cohort, it is quite challenging. In terms of training them and ensuring consistency, we ran a sort of couple of hours workshop before the process started, where we talked to them about the purpose of the framework. We talked to them about the presentations. We had some presentations already recorded, and so we ran a sort of calibration session where we all watched the same recordings. We all gave the ratings and the feedback that we would give, and then we just calibrated those to make sure everybody was on track. So yeah, a couple of hours sort of workshop training, some example videos to look at. And then in terms of you asked about the format of the feedback, within this online portal, it's very easy. They just have they watch the video right there, and then just to the right, I think lots of us are used to marking in that way now, there's a couple of boxes. One, the rating goes in, and then one, they write the feedback, and then off that goes. And then as tutors, we had a look through the feedback for the people in our groups before it went out.
Thank you, Charlotte. Now, I was curious because in many of my teaching, I use simulated clients, and mock employers reminds me of that, and there's lots of organization and training dedicated to that. Yes. Thank you.
The behind the scenes work is often the most challenging, isn't it?
My other question is, you've mentioned that it's within a core embedded module. So I'm curious, which course did you pick to embed this activity?
This was delivered across our suite of LLB law degrees. So all of our qualifying law degrees at Portsmouth, this module was delivered to those students.
Thank you. And my last question is, you've specifically mentioned second year students that you've picked. Can you explain why that's the case, or
Yeah, that's a fair question, and I haven't got a particularly profound answer to it, I'm afraid. That they were picked because that was where, at the time, the career management module sat. It sat at what we call level 5, so it sat at second year, and so that's where I embedded it. Now the work starts at level 4, so for our first years. So we're launching a new programme in September, and the first years will have this as part of a new module that they will receive. And I think there's been a real shift in where we focus our career management learning, because what we've realised is, and employers and alumni and our students have said this as well, is that actually the second year is quite late. The second year of a 3-year law degree is late, because in the second year the students are applying for, on our course they can apply for an optional placement year, either in a law firm or in industry, And they're also, of course, applying for mini pupilages if they want to go to the bar, or they're applying for vacation schemes, summer internships. And even in the UK, they're applying for their training contracts from that second year of study, certainly under the old regime. And so actually, this work around identity, I think, is really important to start in first year, because we're asking them to grapple with really big concepts and really big questions. And I think the earlier they can start that, the better. And I think it's often easier to capture them in first year as well, because my experience this year has been they tend to just accept that as being part of the university experience. By second year, they've got quite busy, quite focused on classification, and it can be a bit easier to capture them at that point as well. But that's just my personal experience on our course.
Thank you, Charlotte. One more question. Since our third speaker is not able to join us today, I think we have time for one more question. My question is, basically, it's a wonderful project, but often it's a resource issue, right? So do you think this Valueme project would be best supported by academic teachers, or do you think it's best supported by careers counselor or careers advisors?
I think it depends on the individuals involved, and that was one of the things that came out of the study. I think it's absolutely crucial that whoever's delivering it has the confidence to deliver it, has the experience in the sort of career management space, or career development space, and has the enthusiasm for it, because actually the students that can feel quite vulnerable as they're going through the process. So it's absolutely crucial that they are with somebody in terms of a tutor who not only buys into the process, but who really believes in it as well, and who really is encouraging, but also knowledgeable. So it depends on the profile of the academics. And I think if the academics, quite understandably, don't feel confident to be delivering this, we have a mix of ex-practitioners and then career academics in our school. And so there might be variations within that as to who would feel more comfortable delivering. But I think certainly the career professionals are well placed to deliver this. So I think, yeah, you've hit on a tension, and I think that's probably for each school to decide based on the profile of people that they have.
Thank you, Charlotte. Thank you, Charlotte, for your time today. And thank you all the participants for joining us today. I'm sure we've learned a lot from this Valueme Framework sharing.